everyone, and welcome to another edition of The Bookshelf, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. In this podcast, we chat with authors about their books on South Asian politics, economics, and society. My name is Tanujja, and I'll be hosting today's episode. Today we have Dr. Rochona Majumdar, who is the George V. Bobrinskoy Professor and Chair of the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. A historian of modern India with a particular focus on Bengal, her work spans diverse fields, ranging from art cinema in India to post-colonial theory. Her research and writing explore how historical consciousness takes shape through culture, aesthetics, and social institutions. Dr. Rochana's scholarship has been recognized internationally, and her projects continue to bridge worlds of history, politics, and art. In her acclaimed book, Art Cinema and India's Forgotten Futures, Film and History in the Postcolony, Dr. Rochona examines how Indian art cinema, emerging in the years after independence, became a powerful medium for exploring history and imagining the nation's future. Through close readings of filmmakers such as Satyajit Ray, Mrinal Sen, and Ritwik Ghatak, she argues that these films did more than narrate the nation's post-colonial experience. They theorized it, anticipating some of the key insights of post-colonial thought. Drawing on film society archives and cultural debates from the 1950s to the 1970s, Dr. Rochona shares how art cinema evolved from a tool of nation building into a reflective, critical form that captured the contradictions and unrealized hopes of the post-colonial moment in India at that time. The book redefines the relationship between film, history, and imagination, offering a new lens on how cinema can both record and rethink the past. Welcome, Dr. Rochona.
Thank you so much. And if you're comfortable with it, you can just call me by my first name and drop the doctor.
No, I'll say doctor.
Oh, okay. And thank you for such a close and thoughtful reading of the book that maintains so much fidelity to some of the things that I was trying to think through.
Okay, so let's begin. You pointed out that post-independence, ideologies like Marxism and indigenous socialism fell short of capturing and providing solutions to the problems a newly independent India was facing. And in analyzing art cinema post-1960s, specifically films by Sen, Ghatak, and Ray, you show that amazingly, these films could theorize what was to unfold in India, even before some historians did. You sought to explain this in the book, that in capturing the post-colonial present through a historiographical operation, or rather the process of creating a historical narrative, these filmmakers better theorize the possible future of India. Can you share a little more about this and how you came to notice these patterns in the films?
Well, it goes to your question goes to the heart of some of the things that I was both trying to explicate in the book, but also something that drew me to some of these filmmakers in the first place. Now, this idea that somehow film and filmmakers were more prescient than professional historians, very simply put, what I was trying to say over there is that they were not overcommitted to the idea that history has a dialectic which actually proceeds through contradiction onto some kind of synthesis. Even though they had broadly leftist sensibilities, what distinguished their approach, say, from those of later professional historians who eventually come to many of the same diagnoses, if you will, of the post-colonial present, was the fact that they let themselves have a certain openness to the present and allowed for their films to dwell in that present. So if you watch Sen, Ray, and Ghatak's works, particularly from the 1960s, things may have been a little different say in the period from 47 to 60, what's really striking is, first of all, the shift, very prominent in someone like Ray, from a belief in the teleology of development, that you go from certain kinds of unfreedom to freedom, from feudalism to capitalism, from country to city, like all of the one-way journeys that we're so used to seeing in historical works. You see a complete abandonment of that in favor of an openness, if you will, of his films to dwell in a present that is governed by multiple temporalities. I'd be happy to illustrate that with an example, but the reason I took the expression historiographical operation from Michel de Certeau to show that what was happening in these films was a way of grappling with the time of the present and trying to grapple with the multiple pasts from which these presents emerge and what kind of potentialities are there in the present. So when I use the expression forgotten futures, I'm really trying to tell readers that, look, the pasts that each of these filmmakers map, standing in their respective presents, give us a hint into other futures that didn't happen but could have.
Mhm.
Do you see? So, does that start to answer your question in some ways?
Yes,
That they were not, it wasn't as if they wanted to see history as the culmination of peasant and workers' movements or women's struggles. I mean, in other words, it's taking a step back, even for people who were imbued with leftist sensibilities from this dialectical notion of history where eventually there'll be some kind of synthesis.
yeah.
They want to, in other words, live in the contradictions. And it's the ability to see the contradictions. And I think that this has something to do with the medium of film that allows you to see and dwell in the contradictions in a way that certain disciplines, academic disciplines, do not.
Yeah, I agree. Especially in capturing a frame, the way that you cannot hide what is in that
Mhm.
frame. It
Absolutely.
forces a kind of immediate reflection as well.
Mhm. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Okay, so you touched on this in your answer already, but often in popular understanding, when people think of history and fiction, they are seen as two separate entities. Of course, history informs fiction, but it isn't common to think that fiction can be used to understand history. And in the
Mhm.
case of your book, you take it a step further with these films theorizing India's future as well as understanding the past. Was it
Mhm.
difficult to prove that bridge between this perceived gulf in understanding?
I thought this was actually a really brilliant, but also quite difficult and challenging question. Um, I mean, oftentimes people write historical fiction and vice versa. There are certain um events that inform, say, the historian's approach. So if you think of Partho Chatterjee's Princely Imposter, which is supposed to be based on a real life event, but it's a case of mistaken identity. Or if you think of Natalie Davis's Return of Martin Gare, and I think these scholars have actually held up in some ways the differences between, um, or Natalie Davis particularly, between history and filmmaking. And Natalie Davis famously said, "Let the past be the past." That's not the kind of relationship that I'm talking about here. Of course, each of the films I analyze in the book are fiction films, but and they're oftentimes, many of them anyway, are adaptations from other people's fiction and stories. But it's really about the kind of tools that the film form makes available to the filmmaker. And also we need to remember that it's a collective operation. It's there are many visions that actually combine into making a film, everything from the cinematographer to the sound artist, the directorial vision, to some extent, even the production, makeup artists, lighting professionals, all of that. But taken together, they give us an experience of the world that I was calling historical or historiographical. Like it gives us a certain handle, if you will, on the complexities of the present, which, to repeat myself, I have yet to see. I mean, I see it in certain historical works, but in a sustained way, in film after film after film. In fact, recently, if I may just go on for a few minutes, I realize my answers are getting a little bit lengthy, so feel free to interrupt. But just this last Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, we had a set of events here that I helped organize with another colleague, uh, Dan Morgan, my colleague in cinema and media studies. It was called Varieties of Melodrama, and it was a celebration of the birth centenaries of Ritik Ghotok and Guru Dutt. And we had 4 screenings, and two each, or 2 of Ghotok and 2 of Dutt. And it gave me the opportunity to rewatch Cloud Cap Star, Meghita Katara, and Shubharna the golden thread, golden line. And so I'll give you a little example to illustrate what I mean from the film Shubharna. So the film is set, as many Ghotok films are, in the immediate aftermath of partition. And it's looking at the lives of refugees from the east into the west. And, it's not the kind of history where you hear, oh, this is what Jinnah did, this is what Nehru did, this is what someone else did. It's looking at the lives of a people who've just been split apart, whose lives have been sort of rent apart by partition, and then to see how they continue to live. There's no question of going back to anything. You're in a new state, and then what happens? Now, within that story, if you've seen the film, you find that there are 2 sequences. One, in 48, there's a newspaper reporter who is standing by a sort of telegraph machine, and he suddenly gets the news of the assassination of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. And, he says it, and as the viewer, you register it. It sort of puts you at a certain point in history, 1948, when Gandhi is assassinated, while also you have these fictionalized refugee characters trying to make a life. And then interestingly, at the film's very end, when I don't want to give any spoilers here, but really at the film's end, at one of its most climactic moments, where the protagonist of the film, after a night of almost debauchery, he finds himself for the first time in his life going to what he thinks is a brothel. And the sex worker he sees there is his sister. And the sister is in such shock at seeing him that she kills herself. And he staggers out of the room and he says, "Hey Ram," again recalling Gandhi's last words, his famous last words. And you want to ask yourself, why did Khattak do it? What was he trying to accomplish by first, in the beginning of the film, giving us this story, giving us the fact that Gandhi had been assassinated, and then in this extraordinarily melodramatic and over the top, but climactic and disturbing sequence. And you realize that the sister had married somebody from a lower caste, and that's something the brother had not been able to accept. He'd rejected the sister. They had not seen each other. And you almost realize that, okay, this is the director's commentary on, are we an independent people if we have not been able to look beyond caste endogamy? How many times must the leader of the nation die before a new nation comes into being? And these are all open questions that are posed to the audience. So, in some ways, that's what I mean about the power of fiction film to make us think in a historical way. He's giving us a lot of details. He's giving us histories of gender, histories of displacement, histories of caste, and how each one is mutually tied and imbricated with the other, and how we read them. Do we read them as stories of success, failure, pain, suffering, or triumph?
Yeah, I guess in a way, the way the audience interprets it is their own relationship to history, current affairs, and all at the time as well.
Absolutely. And also now. I mean, I was actually struck to see how powerful the impact of the film was on people, because everybody knows that Gandhi's last words were those. And then you start asking yourself, why did he do that? In one scene, he just gives you the news. And then in another scene, he says these two words. So how do we actually toggle between one very factual representation and the other just these two words? What meanings do we read into them? And this is what art does in some ways. It solicits interpretation, understanding, and the more you think, the more you are able to grapple with the pasts that have been handed out to you in books, and the past comes to life and even starts to inform our own presence.
Yeah. It's also interesting that at the time, if audiences didn't understand, like you said, you have to really think about it. If they didn't understand, the way of making peace with the film also would have been very different. Now people would come out and just Google it, like, what does it mean and stuff. And
That's for sure. Yeah, no question. Absolutely.
so in the next question, and you addressed some of this, I mean, the anecdote directly leads to this, so it's really great timing. In your close reading of Ghatak's films, you spoke about how various elements of his work, such as the melodrama you mentioned or the prose-like narrative, prevent the audience from completely immersing themselves in the experience of the story. These techniques make Ghatak's films very personal and unique takes on history, and even on the partition of India. From a historical lens, what do you feel he managed to convey through fiction that would have been otherwise difficult to archive or capture only through historical means? And I know you've just mentioned this interplay between the two themes, but anything else you'd like to add?
Sure. So, and it's a coincidence when we first agreed to do this.
Yeah.
I hadn't quite factored in that we were having our event just now. So in some ways, my memory has been refreshed. We've had some excellent discussions over the last few days, and in a lot of ways, I was actually thinking it made me kind of feel good about my book also, because it gave me the opportunity to revisit it, to listen to others talk about it. So all of that was good. But that also means that, as I said, things are fresh in my head. And of course, as you said, you've read the book very closely, and you're absolutely right in saying that the partition of 1947, informs much of his film work and film thinking. One of the things I should clarify, and this could just be me, um, I don't see him as somebody who has some kind of nostalgia to return to a past. New states have been formed. That's just a fact. And he says this repeatedly, that I'm not a politician. I'm interested in seeing what this massive displacement does to the lives of people. And interestingly, he also says at one point that I'm not a filmmaker of despair or decadence. And so if you take a film like Cloud Cap Star, really it's about a first generation, middle class, educated, working woman, and who's studying for a master's degree and needs to drop out of work in order to support her family. And in some ways, she it's her labor and her sacrifices that allow for other family members to flourish. Now, that's the melodramatic part, right? Where why does she have to sacrifice so much? Why can't she look after her own self-interest? A properly feminist narrative would have said that she would say to her parents, she would say to her male siblings, to hell with you. I need to find myself as this and establish myself as a sovereign, independent working woman. I need to look after my interests. I need to look after my health, and that's going to lead to my flourishing. Instead, she even says to the man who's in love with her that we need to wait until my brother stands on his feet, until everyone else is settled. And eventually, what happens is the man cheats on her with her younger sister, marries her, and then she literally, in a very bodily way, you see her fading away because she's afflicted with tuberculosis. Now, all of this is kind of over the top. And yet, through that, in that sort of sense of melodrama, you are made to think about notions of virtue. Sometimes you think that is there really so much self-sacrifice in virtue? You then think, why does she do it? Like, why? And especially the film was made in 1960, we're in 2025. So after all these years, you think, must we see women as these sacrificial creatures? Is there something retrograde in seeing them like that? Until, again, you come to the end of the film where she's talking to an older brother who's now quite successful, and he's visiting her in a sanitarium in the hills. And they're chatting, chit-chatting really. And she first says to him, Dada, older brother, I really want to live. And then there's this extraordinary pan of the hills, and it's almost as if that cry starts to reverberate on every side, like in this 360-degree pan. And it's one of the most powerful scenes in the history of Indian cinema where you realize that, yes, this person is going to die, but her call has become the call of hundreds of thousands of women that we want to live. There's almost a projection into the future of a will to live. And, it's a brilliant way of showing that, yes, a huge historical event has happened. And oftentimes we talk about these big events and their impact on state formation and so forth. Then there are historians like Kamla Bhasin, Ritu Menon, Gyanendra Pandey, who've talked about more personal stories of people whose lives were affected by partition. Kodrok is, he's not talking in a certain way, he's not undertaking that kind of archival research. This film was, in fact, a kind of free adaptation of a story by an author called Shoktipada Rajguru. But really, through the protagonist Nita and the rest of her family, he shows how partition can really have almost pathological consequences on people. And even among the most intimate relations, it can produce, it can actually give rise to certain cruelties. And people are desperate to make new lives for themselves in these colonies. But at the same time, there's also, the film ends with this, on this hopeful note of agency and female agency, even though the agent articulating or giving us that vision of agency might be dying. So it's an interesting way that history and politics and desire, a woman's desire to see herself in the world, come together. I don't know if that's legible or if what I just said, because I'm still very, very much I'm still dwelling on having the impact of having seen these films so recently. I
Yeah,
mean,
no, It makes complete sense, actually. And also because, as you keep mentioning in all of your answers, especially what the filmmakers did, is that these, like you say, when we read about the history now, it's these major events that we're reading summaries of. But the day-to-day reality of it is very different. And how that
Absolutely.
might affect someone and how it plays out in the background of their life versus in the foreground of our understanding is a very different relationship, essentially.
Yes, and oftentimes a respectful historian, say, I'm thinking here of someone like Kamla Bhasin or even Gyan Pandey, they'll in a gesture of respect towards their historical actors, they often say that we have to read through silences. Now, one interesting thing about film is that it shows you, it actually shows you what silence can feel like, what what we do when we say, "Oh, I can't quite talk about the grief that I'm feeling." And then let's say Godok used to do a lot with music and song. And then as you listen to the song, you ask yourself, okay, what's going on here? Why are the two characters seated in the way they are? What are we going to make of that tableau, that arrangement of the way things have been set? What role is the mise en scène playing? So, because of its formal apparatus, there are certain things that films enable. And it's not just the ability to represent the reality out there, but also to create certain realities that may give us a better handle into what they're trying to depict.
In many ways, it's a manipulation. They're trying to convey the feeling of it and the understanding of it before you can sort of mentally capture what is happening.
I think I would prefer the expression interpretation.
Mm.
And of course, because manipulation, it has that
The negative,
undertone of,
yeah,
yes,
negative
exactly, that some
connotation. Yeah.
and whereas I would say that it's an interpretation, a respectful interpretation of a certain reality.
Yeah, one of my film professors used to say that essentially what she was trying to convey is that each frame is a impression that they're giving you. So
Correct.
in film, when you create, essentially you're creating an impression. Of course, how the person interprets it is different, but in that way, it's a kind of arranging of how you should process what you're seeing on screen.
Yes, and also there are enormous risks, right? I mean, the fact that so many of the films that I talk about in the book actually did not do well with audiences. I mean, if you think about it, um, Cloud Capped Star, Megeta Katara, was one of the only films by Ritik Ghatak that was actually successful in the box office. Then there is a very, very moving story about Mrinal Sen's film Calcutta 71, which the story goes, and several people, myself included, Ashish Rajathyaksh, have written about this because this is actually something that happens. So Calcutta 71 is it's a difficult film. I mean, difficult in the sense of it doesn't have one story. It's five stories that are woven together. And it was showing at the theater called Metro in central Calcutta, Kolkata. And Sen had this peculiar habit, many of them did actually, of standing outside of the theater or standing just outside of the hall where the film was being screened because he liked to see the reaction of the audiences to his work. Now, they noticed that often the same people were coming back to watch Calcutta 71. And not only were the same people coming back, in one instance, there was a woman who faints. In another instance, somebody actually comes to him and says, I mean, gets very aggressive and says to him, when did you actually film this particular shot? When did you film it? And he tells them 1970 or something. Then, as they pressure him further, he realizes that because he had been collecting footage of some of the scenes of student protests and student and peasants' protest on the streets of Kolkata for several years now. He was just collecting documentary footage. And in that documentary footage, there were friends and family members who were seeing their loved ones for the last time, after which some of them had been disappeared. And then he says that the film suddenly became so much more impactful, not just for the people who were watching it, but also for its maker. Because it completely changes the relationship that you have to the footage that you'd shot. He thought he'd shot documentary footage that he had put back into a fiction film. And then when people respond to it in this way, you want to ask yourself that is such a sharp division between documentary and fiction film tenable in all cases? There's actually a scholar at Northwestern, Lakshmi Padmanabhan, who raises some of these questions also in her work. But I find that story really, really powerful and moving, that in a fiction film, you suddenly you see these people who have since disappeared or were disappeared by who we don't know, whether it's the party, the state, whoever it is. And suddenly that's your relationship to the film.
Wow, that's quite that's and then to do it unknowingly also is also
Yes, yes. But it also shows how contingent and conjunctural the work of cinema can be. And again, it's a different kind of historiographical operation.
absolutely capturing what has now passed. Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Okay, so in your book, you discussed how in the 1950s there existed this concept of good films and good citizens. Can you tell us more about this?
So when I read that question, I actually pulled out my book and I was wondering if it's even possible to um
Just a brief summary, just the concept of it.
yeah, well, I mean, okay, I was going to read, but I won't. So,
Oh,
you know,
you can go ahead. Please feel free to read.
okay, let's see if I can set it up and then I will. So, in my book, the story of art cinema it begins from the beginning, as it were. So, in 1947, when the first film society is established. And one thing that I cannot repeat enough is that the film societies wanted to expose Indian audiences to both non-Indian as well as um, non-Hollywood films. I mean, some Hollywood, but also non-Hollywood films. In other words, to what we call regional cinema on the one level and world cinema at another level. Now, the question is, were these films available? No. So really, or when they were few and far between. They had to rely on embassies and consulates, and sometimes just the sheer labor that people put in to collecting cans of film somewhere, hauling them to some other place for exhibition. Those are very moving stories. But the point here is that these people, and Satyajit Ray was one of the people who founded the first film society in October of 1947. They often read about films and read about filmmaking before they actually watched the films. Now, so imagine a situation where there is actually a acute shortage of films, and yet such is your devotion and commitment to this medium that you read, you circulate books, then you try desperately to collect these films. Unlike our times, there's no opportunity of a repeat viewing. Sometimes if you want to see a film again, you sit and you wait. So some film has shown in Kolkata, maybe tomorrow it'll show in some district somewhere or maybe in Madras. You try to go and you really file it away. So it's a commitment, it's a project of cultivation, which in their language is actually trying to produce sentient, intelligent, committed viewers. And I was actually tying that with a project of citizenship, where every citizen is not only just has the right to vote, but is thinking for themselves, is an individual, is not someone who expresses, or not someone who can be found embodied in the persona of the great leader. In the notion of good films equals good citizens is actually a deep respect for the citizen as individual, as interpreter, as student. Now, to some people, the good films, good citizens idea might sound elitist, because it's trying to promote a certain kind of pedagogy, right? Teach people how to watch, teach people how to read. But I really think that without a certain educational project, it's very hard to produce excellence. But excellence, again, by definition, is premised on exclusions. And I think the art cinema project from the very beginning is constituted by this contradiction between excellence and exclusion. At the same time, there's something deeply inspiring about it, and it's quite different from the contemporary moment where you have so many leaders all over the world who think of themselves as the embodiment of the masses. I was actually trying to, in the idea of the good citizen, distill out of the masses the notion of an individual. And I don't think it was just me that was trying to do it. I think it was the film society activists who were trying to do it. They had very little money, but they were passionate cinephiles who wanted to teach themselves and others how to read closely. And that's why there's an institution building aspect to this. And eventually, once you've built the institutions, you've read a bunch, many of them go on to become filmmakers, cinematographers. They come into the world of cinema, but really through reading. I mean, in the absence of film schools, film societies were the grounds where you prepared personnel who would then go on to occupy ranks within the film industry.
When you were speaking about it in the book, what I thought was interesting also was maybe not the focus of it, but like a byproduct was, in a sense, it for a while before the 1960s, it became a kind of nation building exercise as well. Like this idea that watching certain films can contribute to a kind of identity for the viewer in a very young India. Yeah, so
do you want to say a little bit more? I find the idea intriguing. I just want to understand it a little better.
As in the idea that at that time, from what I understand, that the filmmakers were in conjunction with the development of India. So in creating the films, before they veered off in the 1960s, in creating the films, there was a kind of feedback loop of the way.
Okay, yeah, okay. I get it. You know, I mean, if it was a direct, if there could be a direct correlation between, say, what you see on the film and what might have been espoused by the government, I think it would make it less interesting. But say if you take something like the Apu trilogy, and of course it's it's a Bildungsroman of boy becoming man, moving from, like I said, from country to city, along the way discovering love, romantic love of a certain kind. That's one kind of story, right? It's a linear story. But then when you watch Pother Panchali and Oporajito and Opu Shongshar, you realize at the end of the story, he's unemployed. He wants to become not a salaried employee, he wants to become a creative individual and is not terribly successful in doing that. You also start noticing all of the other people whose sacrifices are necessary in order for him to get to where he's gotten to. And that then makes you question the narrative of the heroic individual. And then you think, whose story is this? Even though it's called the Apu trilogy, it's as much about his sister Durga, his mother Shorbojaya, his wife Oporna, then his little boy. And then you realize, yes, this is the story of a nation, all of them taken together. And the village that he's leaving can really never be forgotten over the course of the film. So I think in that sense, yes, there's a certain alignment between the filmmaker's view and, say, the early years of the new Indian state, but it's not one without its tension. So the feedback loop is also one that is punctuated and punctured at certain points by these tensions.
Yeah, definitely. And moving forward from that period, you discussed how in India in the 1960s, the post-colonial promise of development and prosperity began to recede and gave rise to civil unrest, anger, and political violence. The films you've analyzed marked a turning point as they moved away from capturing the development, what we just spoke about, nation state. For Satyajit Ray's films, especially with the Apu trilogy, capturing that particular moment, even though it goes across a period of time, capturing that period is a very potent experience, even for a viewer now. It's transportive, melancholic, and gives a clarity of perspective that doesn't have much influence of colonization or ideology. You spoke about how Ray used time as a visceral tool. Can you share a little bit more about this? And I think you touched on it earlier when you said that these tools were made to influence the viewer and the experience as well.
Well, I mean, again, I think this is a challenging question, and sometimes I feel as if there's no good way to respond to them without referring to the particulars of the film. So I think one thing I should clarify is that we need to make a distinction between Ray's early filmmaking period, which starts with Song of the Little Road, Pather Panchali, 1955. And I would say the films that of that period, that early period, ends with a film like The Lonely Wife, Charulata, which is 1964. The period that commences thereafter is what people call his middle period. And I have taken another trilogy, which is actually less well known than the Apu trilogy. It's his City trilogy. And I've analyzed that. And one thing I've done is I've compared the Apu trilogy and the City trilogy because both have male protagonists at their center. And I found that in the Apu trilogy, Ray seems to, he seems to be able to give us a far better and far clearer depiction of this male protagonist with their everything from their desires, the selfishness of some of those desires, the precarity of some of those desires, the sacrifices, the losses, all of that far better than he is able to do for the protagonists of the City trilogy. I mean, those films are very much about the men. Ray says very little. Each one has important female characters, but you don't really get such a deep insight into them. And it seems as if in the male protagonists of the City trilogy are men in crisis. They start out as unemployed youth. In each one, they have a different resolution. In one case, one becomes extremely corrupt. Actually, in two cases, they become corrupt and enter into a universe which obviously you can tell Ray is quite critical of, but nevertheless, it's this notion that we often have that you got to do what you got to do. And there's a sense of resignation, and which is actually not there in the Apu trilogy. The Apu trilogy is still full of hope, despite all the depth that you see, despite the really poignant sequences. The City trilogy is quite brutal. And it's brutal because it shows these people trapped in certain ways in a post. Front door doorbell. Okay, we need to just pause this for a second, like you said, because our cleaners are here.
Okay,
So,
sure.
I mean, I hope it doesn't get super noisy, but maybe that little
Yeah,
bit should, just because the nest on my shelf started
no worries.
speaking. Someone other than myself started speaking, but they'll be, unfortunately, they're going to be here for a little bit, and I hope we don't hear the drone of the vacuum cleaner too loudly.
Okay, no worries at all. Yeah.
But in any case, so to go back to what I was saying, there's when I say that they were disillusioned with the post-colonial present, that's what I meant, that there was no place to escape from the disillusionment. So one option would be to make fantasy films. And Ray does that also. He makes children's films, fantasy films, but with films like the City Trilogy or a film like Days and Nights in the Forest, which has recently been restored, there's a very beautiful copy of it available. You'll find that you see people who are trapped in a certain present, and the filmmaker's task is to show the many contours of what it feels like to be locked in a present. And the reason why I found it almost useful for my own ability to survive through difficult times is because each of these films actually give you a way of confronting the confusing present that each of us inhabit in certain ways. And maybe to see what happens when we stay with the trouble, to quote Donna Haraway, what happens or what does it feel like to stay with the trouble? Amitav Ghosh called it in a different context, the great derangement. What does it feel like to live in the great derangement? I think that that's something each of these filmmakers, Ray, of course, prominent among them, give you a sense of through their works from the 1960s onward.
And it's in that clarity of capturing that moment also that brings both, like as you said in your book, it brings possibility for the future, possible futures, and then from there, how society.
Yes, yes, and again, I'm not saying that each of those futures did happen, but at least when you watch them, you realize, oh, this could have happened, but it didn't. And then you want to ask yourself, why didn't it? It gives us a more complex understanding of what possibilities were missed, how we missed them, and what we might do about trying to make some of those possibilities happen.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Okay. In many ways, the films you've chosen have a lot in common with post-colonial cinema across the world, or rather with films that emerged post-World War II. However, there is a difference in tonality. From third cinema, there's The Hour of the Furnaces to the neo-realist film Bicycle Thieves. These films create restlessness and stir the viewer's awareness towards action. The films you've chosen in their slower pace seem to convey a kind of acceptance. And even if acceptance isn't the right word, there is an absence of decisive action. And we've spoken a little bit about this already. What political or cultural context do you feel gives the film this particular tone?
So let me take it as a two-part question because the two films you've taken are so different. So Bicycle Thieves and then Hour of the Furnaces. Now, even among my three the three filmmakers that occupy very important space in my book, as you know, there's this famous apocryphal story about Ray that when he first went to England, the first film that he saw was Bicycle Thieves. And there's this wonderful account of this in his book, Our Films, Their Films. And everyone remembers this, that, oh, Ray saw bicycle films. What they don't remember is that what he had gone to watch was a double bill. So, of which the first one was Bicycle Thieves, the second was a Marx Brothers film, Night at the Opera. So, somebody like Ray, his early career is, I mean, it's really a very, very cinephilic career. And I think that there are shades of that in his filmmaking. Um, and not just from the films he watched, from the family he came. Uh, his father and grandfather, as you know, had a lot to do with writing for children. And I think you see all of these multiple tones filter into his films. So, plus, there's also a very strong commitment, especially in the early work, to ideas of rationalism. And I think that they are not, certainly in the early work, they don't make them, it's not the one register of acceptance, but it is trying to take all of these inheritances to see what complexity results. Now, Bicycle Thieves ultimately is quite a melodramatic film, right? It's talking about post-war Italy. It's about a father-son relationship. It's about learning to live with poverty, if you will. Hour of the Furnaces, on the other hand, has a very clear revolutionary message. Now, I've recently, well, not so recently anymore, but I've written a bit about Mrinal Sen and the Hour of the Furnaces because after my book came out, I mean, the things you miss when you're doing research for your book, but I've seen Sen's trilogy so many times because each my book is structured around three trilogies. One thing I missed is in the last of his Calcutta trilogy, Sen's, he actually has an actual citation from Hour of the Furnaces. I mean, except it's not cited as such. But I spotted it and I thought, wait a minute, how did I miss this? What is this about? Like there's this sequence from Hour of the Furnaces that actually appears in it. And then I did a little bit of digging and I realized that Sen had actually once met Solanas. And years later, I think 1994, Solanas came to Calcutta and Sen met him, and he said, I've cited you in one of my films. And Solanas says, I've cited so many people in my films, oftentimes without crediting them. The reason I'm narrating this story is to say that there are many filmmakers from the global south, Mrinal Sen and Fernando Solanas among them, who are committed to the vision of a kind of revolution. However, there are also deep differences. So if you watch Hour of the Furnaces in its entirety, the 4+ hours, you find that the first part actually ends on this in this inspiring way with the death of Che, or with the image of a dead Che Guevara. But then the second and third parts are quite reactionary. And sometimes I've wondered, and I would have asked him this if I met him and could interview him. I'm curious about which part Mrinal Sen felt most inspired by. I'm pretty sure it could not have been the second and third part.
Yeah.
He probably was much more taken by the first hour and 30 minutes, which is the first part of the film. And it's entirely possible that that's what he watched. But to go back to, so to respond to your question, I think we need to keep in mind the uneven viewing context, uneven reception context of these films, but also the fact that social change and political change would have meant very different things to these different filmmakers. For Solanas and Getino, they were Peronists eventually. Sen would never have subscribed to any model of authoritarianism. I mean, if anything, he lived the longest. He lived longer than Ray or Godok. But each one of them actually had deep critiques of authoritarianism. So in that sense, I think there are fundamental differences. And that's why in Sen's Calcutta trilogy, there's actually a critique of authoritarianism even within the Communist Party. So it ends by saying we need to reform things. We cannot let things be as they are. And if that means you break away, you take stock of what the situation is, that's what you do. That's what acceptance looks like. where you critique the place that revolution you think, or you critique the agent that you all this while thought might have brought about the revolution. Hmm? So
Yeah, that's really,
it's an intolerance for formulas. Insofar, yeah. And I hope that something came through in that
yes,
long response.
definitely. Especially the last sentence, you phrased it wonderfully, which is that essentially, in a way, the acceptance is still agency. It's still a choice
Absolutely.
to how you want to respond to the current situation. And with the other two films, The Hour of Furnaces and Bicycle Thieves, even politically, the trajectory of the country also didn't really quite follow a very straightforward route, right? So this continuous movement, in a way, the films that you've analyzed, they kind of provide a kind of solution just for your inward self rather than um, a didactic call to arms.
Mhm.
So in that
Yeah,
sense, it's very interesting.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's almost like sometimes it's easier to be programmatic. It's much more difficult to break rank and say, no, I'm going to be critical of some programmatic call, even if I'm the only person to do so.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, I think in many of these films, you see protagonists who are lone voices, male or female. Yeah.
Definitely. Okay. Speaking strictly as a historian, if you could choose, what event would you have liked to see portrayed on screen?
Oh dear, I really thought about this was the hardest question. And I'm sure I couldn't think of something, but I did think of something else because I was really this question kind of kept me awake at night. And and I was thinking that I don't think I'm drawn to big events because I mean I'm drawn, but then expectations are raised and then they get dashed, right? Which is why I keep going, which is why that scene from Subarna Rekha keeps playing in my head. Uh, the two deaths of Gandhi that occur over the course of the film. Instead, I think one thing that I found very inspiring is a recent urge among scholars, film scholars, to start analyzing home movies. My colleagues here at the University of Chicago have a phenomenal home movies project where they went to the south side of Chicago and collected these home movies that show birthdays, uh, marriages, or just religious events or some personal event, deaths, but events that are events in the lives of individuals. Recently, there's actually a book by Ishita Tiwari, I think, that actually looks at Indian video cultures. And I was thinking that given that we live in a media saturated world, I want to think a little bit more about what these events mean in the lives of people who are constantly filming. Who are constantly filming. Are they absolutely superfluous? Or what would it be like to compare say, people who are still making videos of special events? You've probably seen videos, say, of uncles and aunts when this culture was still new and people dressed up in a certain way and they dressed up for the camera. And then compare that, say, to the selfie generation and the reel and the TikTok generation. And I think I'm very interested in thinking about the valence of events or people shooting something and saying, I was there. I went to this march or I did this. And that's not a response to your question, but I'm really interested in the everydayness of events and how that manifests or is forgotten in the voluminous material, image material that we collect, each one of us does in our everyday lives. That's such a cop out of what would have been a really, but I really could not settle for a single event. I kept thinking of many, but then I don't know. I don't think I've really witnessed a historical event unless it's secondhand.
Yeah.
And then I'm not particularly interested in what others think of it. I mean, there'll be inspirational talk. There'll be, or you see lots of images, say, of statues being toppled or people crying when, say, a great leader is elected, or say you see images of social movements of hundreds of thousands of people on the street, and they're very inspiring in the moment, and then bad things happen. And all of that, the cycle is reversed. I'm more interested in individuals and the micro, the personal, and how that might manifest or not, as I said.
Mm. It's very, very in line with the films you chose to analyze for the book as well.
Okay, I'm consistent.
Consistent, exactly. Okay, so lastly, the types of stories and narratives that are currently being greenlit in India seem to be influenced by the current political climate. Within this changing environment and rhetoric in India, what films do you feel, if any, have accurately captured this present moment?
Oh, I think there are many actually. Um, so I think both in the world of documentary and fiction film, we're going through a very exciting time. And the other thing I should clarify here is that my appetite for films is voracious. So I watch I watch films that are mostly traveling, say, on the festival circuit. Now, of course, I watch a lot of shows. Even I try to think about what the structure of shows are telling us. Some shows I think are excellent. I mean, for example, Patal Lok is a show I like a lot. But if I had to, and then of course there are some which are just propaganda. But it's also interesting to see how propaganda happens. But of films that have actually left their mark on me, or recent things I've watched. So one that I watched very, very recently is um, is a film called Humans in the Loop. And it's about an Adivasi woman and the way in which she starts participating in the creation of artificial intelligence. And I think the film is a phenomenal reflection on the ways in which women, particularly indigenous women, might suffer from from technology in both ecological and personal ways. But then how that can also turn into an opportunity for them, how they can become creators of data. It's it really is an extraordinary film, and I think it's so subtle, it's so quiet. I think you would really enjoy watching them. I mean, watching it. Another film that had a very profound impression on me was Payal Kapadia's. I mean, the one that she made just now, the one that was celebrated a great deal. All That We Know Is Light. I liked it very, very much, but I liked even more the one that was made before that, A Night of Knowing Nothing.
Okay.
I thought that was an absolutely brilliant, brilliant docufiction, sort of dream documentary structure. And it takes you through, um, again, the question of the importance of student movements, but within student movements, which are supposed to be so egalitarian, the deep inequalities, in this case, along caste lines that cleave these movements, and how that might be narrated. That's a film that uh, that affected me profoundly. I like Shaunak Sen's work a
Mm.
great deal. I mean, very, very, very much.
All that breathes, right? That's the
Yes, All That Breathes. I
all that.
think it's just so, so brilliant. I mean, to bring together concerns of eco-criticism to bear on contemporary history, I think it's genius. And I
Mm.
think that these are filmmakers who are responding in really thoughtful ways to a present where there may be a drumbeat of runaway rampant capitalism, authoritarianism, um, or all manner of human conflict. But at least the three films that I was thinking, if I, I- but I think there's a lot of good work happening, a lot of very, very, very thoughtful, very good work that's taking place. And sometimes it's hard to keep up with the kind of work that's actually taking place in India or
The
coming out of India or the subcontinent, really. Mhm.
Yeah, the variety and the number of films being created also.
I mean, another film that I really feel compelled to mention, it was just a brilliant, brilliant take on urbanity and gender, is Joyland.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Absolutely brilliant. I mean, so I don't think that there's any dearth of extraordinarily creative filmmaking, regardless of the difficult political times that we live through.
Mm.
And my respect for these filmmakers is immense. I mean, I haven't had the good fortune of meeting any of them, but
Yeah.
hopefully someday.
Yeah. Joyland is Pakistani also, actually, I think.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Thank you for a wonderful discussion, Dr. Rochna. We have been discussing her book, Art, Cinema, and India's Forgotten Futures, Film and History in the Postcolony. A thank you to Yusuf and Devyani as well for organizing this. We'll see you again in January with another edition of ISA's Bookshelf. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking to you.